Well, good afternoon, everyone. We want to welcome you back for the fourth and final session with Dr. Campbell. She needs no introduction by this point, so all I would like to say is that after her presentation this afternoon, we're going to have another question and answer session. So those of you who are physically present and those of you who are online can raise your hands and ask questions or send them in through the internet, and she will do her best to answer them. So, Dr. Campbell, the time is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm getting adept at this sound system, just about in time to leave, unfortunately. But this afternoon, we are going to talk about the contribution of women in Adventist history. You know what? I just realized I don't know where the clicker is. Oh, there it is. Okay. Just a second. And here I thought I had the whole system down. So, I know I originally titled it, and I didn't change the title, The Shunammite Woman, Financing Mission in the Adventist Church. That's partially because that was a gap in our podcast, that the treasurer of the North American division, that is a woman, kept reminding me of. But I'm going to diverge quite substantially from what I said I was going to talk about and do a little bit more broader of a survey because, hey, I guess I can do that, right? The story of the Shunammite woman, of course, is that story from Elisha. Just wanted to start out with that text and a reminder that women have long financed mission. And in the story of Elisha, he goes to Shunem, a foreign place for him, and there's a wealthy woman who encounters him and provides him food. Not only does she provide him food, she knows that he's going to visit a lot, and so she goes to her husband and says, let's make a room for him. She sees a need and she seeks to fill it, much like Zell did in our morning presentation. And so she makes a small room for Elisha, and then one day while he's there and resting, he notices her need. First she responds to his need, and then he notices her need, and she is blessed with a son who then dies tragically, and Elisha raises him from the dead. And women have long, yes, as I said, noticed the need in the community and in the need for missions. That's right, I was going to start with Sarah Osborne. So Sarah Osborne predates the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but since I'm skipping a whole bunch of history, I did want to point out that in that gap period, women still were actively involved in missions, and Sarah Osborne is a little bit of a precursor to the Adventist Church, I like to think. She was born in England, but lived as an adult in New England, so she was an American, and gets very sick, extremely sick, so sick that she can barely leave her house. But instead of seeing that as an encumbrance, as preventing her from ministry, instead she uses that sickness as a springboard into ministry. And people start coming to her house to listen to her preach from her ill bed. And becomes very popular as a preacher because, hey, it's not a church, it's not the four walls of a sanctified church. And so even in this early time in American history, if you wanted to preach from your home, generally they let you do it. Now the local pastor got a little worried about this, and sometimes came and visited and listened to her speak. Sarah Osborne, however, was not a totally exemplary character because she actually was a slave owner herself. She owned a little boy, and we don't think of New England associated with slave ownership, but actually it was at one point not that uncommon for somebody to have a slave in New England, and she was one of many. Until one day, the mother of the boy comes to her and has a long heart-to-heart talk with Sarah Osborne and tells her how awful slavery was. And to her credit, Sarah realized, well, to the credit of the mother too, of the poor enslaved little boy, she realizes that slave ownership is wrong. And spends her next few years preaching both to white people as well as enslaved or formerly enslaved people, and ends up bringing quite a few people to her services. But it's a reminder that even when we're serving as good Christians, sometimes we have blind spots, right? And Sarah Osborne definitely had a blind spot when it came to her treatment of African Americans. But Sarah is just a reminder that there is some continuity, that over time, women have served in many mission fields, including in preaching, not just in the Old Testament, not only through the mode of print like Zell did, but also sometimes through preaching from their own homes, and sometimes by realizing, so she's actually becomes the early abolitionist, somebody who's promoting that they should not own slaves. But it takes that moment of insight from another woman telling her how awful it was to her own family life, for that insight to come. So in the Adventist Church, just also want to highlight that in the Millerite movement, although we often focus on the men, on William Miller and Samuel Snow and Fitch and all of these other men that were doing a lot of the preaching, in the Millerite movement, there were also quite a few women that preached as well. And they actually had at one time a journal that was particularly aimed at women. They knew that women were often the people in the household who would promulgate Christianity and morals and talk to their children. And so they actually particularly aimed some of their preaching at women as well as journal activities. So women were actively involved. They've always been actively involved in the church or in the foundations of the Adventist Church. Oh, I'm giving you a long list of women that were involved in the Millerite movement. This is actually a picture of the periodical that was aimed particularly at women. It's called Adventist Message to the Daughters of Zion. And was put together by a woman named it's actually Clorinda is her real name, Clorinda. I don't know that we would name a lot of our daughters that today. But Clorinda S. Minor, who was editor and early Zionist. And when I teach a class in American history, I often point out that people who were involved in one reform movement often got involved in multiple reform movements because they started, once you see one person's need, it opens your eyes to seeing lots of people's needs. And Emily Clemens Pearson, the top person, and we often think of other authors of anti-slavery books. She's relatively unknown today, but Emily Clemens Pearson, and she's highlighted, by the way, in the podcast too. Kevin Burton talks a lot about her because he's done a lot of research on women in their pre-Adventist community in the Millerite movement. Was the author of anti-slavery books. Not only was she involved in spreading the Adventist message, but she was out there trying to encourage to end the end of slavery. And she actually had real life lived experience because she was from the South, from a family of people who owned slaves. And so she knew firsthand the evils of enslavement and promoted it against that. Sojourner Truth was also very briefly involved, but I have a picture of her because, of course, she's well known, and she actually has a long history that ends up she spends a lot of time actually involved in the Adventist Church in some ways, too. She ends up living, so there's she ends up living and dying in Battle Creek. And Abigail Folsom was an abolitionist and feminist. A lot of the women that get involved in the Millerite movement do get involved in all three of their big reform movements at the time. Looking towards Christ's second coming, wanting the end of slavery, because if you're going to preach the gospel to all nations and all people, then you need to reach all people, right? And how are you going to reach people that are enslaved? They need to have freedom in order to be evangelized effectively. And many of these women also got involved eventually in the women's rights movement, arguing that women need greater rights in the community, ownership of land. They often got involved in the temperance movement because they saw temperance, that alcoholism was hurting women, they argued, because men would spend all their money on liquor and would come home and beat their wives and children, and that if we were going to have a truly Christian, if we were going to allow people to live out their Christianity, we needed to end alcoholism too. Oh, and Kevin Burton actually talks quite a bit, back to the podcast, about G.S. Miles, who's a fascinating character, so I won't tell you all about her, but she was a reformer. She ran an orphanage. She was an abolitionist. She did everything. She was a seamstress, and she was not married either, never, as far as we can tell, not ever married. But she did everything, and she was a very big advocate for the Millerite movement. And many of these women found the reason that they could speak out or wanted to speak out was this Joel 2:28 text. And afterward I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. And they noticed that word daughters. If God calls sons and daughters to prophesy. So women need to prophesy for Christ to come. And so women need to be involved in writing and preaching and proclaiming the good news of Christ's second coming. So there was a great deal of promotion of that. And of course, this ends up bleeding into the Adventist church as we see it now. So the Millerite movement, at the end of the Millerite movement, the death of the Millerite movement was not the death of women's involvement in the Adventist movement. Annie Rebecca Smith is one of my husband's favorite characters. I know he may have talked already here about her. She was, as he likes to call her, the poet laureate of the Adventist church. She was a very talented writer and editor, published outside the Adventist church too some of her poems, but also was the editor for the Adventist Review. Sadly, like so many women of the time period, and my children hate a lot of the Adventist history stories because they say that we know how the story is going to end. Well, this was when they were really little. We know how the story is going to end. The people are going to die of consumption. And indeed, in this story, that is true. There was we don't always appreciate modern medicine as much as we should. The 19th century had many good things about it, but one of the bad things was a lack of modern medicine, and especially antibiotics. And in the 19th century, there seems to be a rise in tuberculosis. I know I have a literature professor here too. She can testify that there were even some famous literary figures, writers, that also died of consumption. It was a pandemic, basically, in the 19th century America and Europe as the urbanization increases and people lived inside, and there's some indication that it might have been spread by milk, unpasteurized milk as well, but also just that close contact with people. Tuberculosis spread a lot. So Annie Smith, sadly and very tragically died there. We have a beautiful poem by her mother celebrating her life and legacy because she died so young and took out one of the many talented early Adventists. So there were a lot of women that preached at the time, Ellen Lane being one of them. She first preached in conjunction with her husband. She actually was born in 1844, strangely enough. But even though she was not obviously part of that Millerite movement, and if she was born in 1844, but she was an early convert to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the man that she married was a pastor, and okay, so we have a pastor here, and I guess I have been a pastor's wife as well. Oftentimes, ministry is a two-person calling. That whether the spouse wants to be involved or not, they get dragged into it as well, because there's always stuff to do around a church. And Ellen Lane found that to be the case too, and so when they went traveling around and were preaching, because the churches at the time couldn't support a pastor, so much of the preachers were itinerant, she started preaching as well. And actually ended up being one of the first people that we have documentation of receiving a ministerial license. This is in the very early years of the Adventist church when we don't have a lot of amazing records. It's not an organized church, and so conferences and local churches, are doing kind of a little more of the ordination service than, and there's not a yearbook as it comes in later on where we have a list of all the ordained ministers, and it's really easy to do the research. Finding people who had ministerial license takes a lot of digging and a lot of reading Adventist reviews to find who did the actual preaching and who had ministerial licenses, because conferences would issue separate lists anyways. Just appreciating the work of, I didn't find Ellen Lane, so I am not claiming to have found her as one of our first women preachers. But to the people who did, it takes a lot of digging and a lot of work of reading a lot of reviews to find them. Just because of the odd way that we have the ministerial licenses listed at the time. Anyway, she received a ministerial license annually from 1875 to 88. So she received these on her own. After her husband died, she continued preaching, as you can see. And then after a little bit of her preaching on her own, again, preaching was kind of a tough gig for women or men because oftentimes it meant traveling a lot. She moved into instead temperance work, was the secretary treasurer, which in the conference office today would just be treasurer. They just used the word secretary to designate that at the time. And then became the president of the Michigan Temperance and Health Society. So she's really a foundational member of the Adventist Church because she played so many roles. Secretary treasurer is one of the 3 top positions that we had at the time in conferences, and so she was in charge of the money. In fact, lots of women were secretary treasurers at the time. So a lot of those were held by women. Sarah Lindsay as well is one of the earliest preachers we have record of. She does predate 1844, but was a famous Adventist preacher. And so there's an inspiration. We know exactly what helped inspire Lindsay's ministry because there's a passage written that we have documentation anyways. A guy named B.F. Robbins wrote this to the female disciples in the Third Angel's Message. And because, I love Mary Magdalene now, he actually mentions Mary Magdalene as one of the Marys, as why women should be female disciples and should go out and share the gospel. And we know that this is one of the reasons that Sarah Lindsay went ahead and became a minister herself. So I like that connection. We also have evidence, of course, of Ellen White getting credentials, ministerial credentials regularly and as the church got more organized, she didn't just receive them from the conference. Initially, it was from the Michigan Conference, and then later it was from the General Conference that gave her ministerial licenses. So they issued those in order to make sure that the person preaching was noted as an official person that could be allowed to preach. Oh, yeah, so that's the happy news. The sad news is that there was declining positions for women in leadership in the 20th century. We have lots of evidence that, and again, I didn't actually create these. These were created by a group back in the 80s, I believe, 90s, of how many women were involved in different ministries in the Adventist Church. And you can see that if you look at the early 1900s, this chart starts out in 1900 and goes to 1990, that at the beginning of 1900, when the church is just fairly newly organized, there are lots of women that are participating. 30% of the conference secretaries are women. By 1950, there's 0. Same kind of thing with departmental secretaries. You actually see initially an increase in the beginning of the 20th century and then a drastic decline. Education department secretaries, all those kinds of positions, women often decline. And there's a lot of debate about what caused this rapid and kind of dramatic decline. Some of it, of course, has been argued that it had to do with the Great Depression. The church suffered just like everybody else during the Great Depression, and so people had to decide where they were going to spend their money. If you only have a small budget, who do you choose to keep hiring? And oftentimes the choice was the men, because they were assumed to be the breadwinners of the family, and so women often were laid off just to save money or chose to take a lower paying position or a volunteer position instead. And World War II, along with the 1950s, also contributed to this kind of rapid decline. But instead of focusing on the negative, I'm going to, and I did not finish that slide. I'm going to focus on some of the positive examples. Nellie Drulard, and she plays very closely into the Shunammite woman, is definitely a Shunammite woman of the Adventist Church. Nellie Drulard had an adventurous life. She was not content to living only in the United States and serving God only in the United States. Instead, she went with her husband, Alma, as a missionary to South Africa. Like Zell this morning, she never had any children of her own. She got married kind of later in life to Alma, and she and Alma headed off to do missions in South Africa. And apparently although Alma was the first one listed as being called to mission, she rapidly showed that she was very talented in her own field, and so we end up getting lots of reports about Nellie instead of Alma, and because she's also writing back. She and her husband helped pick the property that now is Salusi University. At the time, it was called something else that I'm going to have to look up really quick. But it was not Salusi originally. They were, Okay, I'm not finding it fast enough. So they ended up helping to purchase and pick out. She did a lot of tasks while she was in South Africa serving as a missionary. And then when she came back to, back to the United States, she believed she wanted to continue serving God. And they actually came back to the United States in part because her husband, Alma, was very sick. Back to, this is kind of pre-antibiotics, pre-modern, all the vaccines that we have today. And so he had gotten sick while they were in South Africa, and he continued to decline and died shortly after they came back to the United States. But Alma had a lot of energy. She didn't have any kids. She had a lot of talent. She had a lot of skill, and she was not going to let it put her down just because her husband was dead. And apparently, she was brilliant at earning money on her own. And that brilliance was recognized. So she did a lot of real estate transactions. It seems like I'm not entirely clear on all the ways that she earned money, but I know some of it was in real estate. And as a result of her brilliance in managing and earning money, she, for a while, was Andrews University. She was a finance year of Andrews University. And then she moved down south. She had read Ellen White's counsel about doing more work in the South, and decided that that they needed to do more intentional work among African Americans. And so she decided that she would take up the standard and go south, which indeed she did, and ended up establishing 2 institutions. Riverside Sanitarium was an institution. Basically, sanitarium, you have to understand, is the 19th century term for a hospital. It tended to be more holistic than a traditional hospital, where they did a lot of holistic medicine and focused on proper diet and ventilation and getting exercise and fresh air and eating good food. And so a lot of our institutions, early Adventist institutions, all have the term sanitarium on there. As we get into the 1950s, usually that changes to hospital and later on into the medical center. The Riverside Sanitarium was an institution that was designated in Nashville, Tennessee. These are both institutions in Tennessee, that was especially designated to take care of African Americans at the time that it was established. Now, this is a much later building that was built after after Nellie died, we have segregation and Jim Crow laws, right? The Civil War has ended, but then you wait a few decades and Jim Crow laws put you back in a really bad place where there's segregation, so African Americans can't, especially in the South, but even in the North, can't be treated at particular facilities. In fact, we have a very tragic story. The woman's name is not going to come to mind right off the top of my head, but we have a tragic case in Maryland that occurs where an Adventist woman from New York is brought down to the Adventist hospital there because they want her to go to an Adventist institution. She's very ill. Byron, yes. And she is taken there to the hospital and ends up, they kick her, think she's white at first because she's of mixed race, and so she's kind of light-skinned, and they take her in at first, and then they figure out that she's African American, and they kick her out of the hospital, and she ends up dying in this process, and not immediately or directly, but sort of, and so there's a lot of, there's a push at that point to start doing better servicing, caring for African American Adventists. Anyways, but that's long after Nellie, I keep calling her by her husband's name, Nellie, and her foundation of Riverside Sanitarium. So she establishes the sanitarium. It actually lasts for a long time after her death, before it's eventually sold off. But it was a community, a sanitarium that was there to serve the African American community, as well as to had like a nursing school attached to it to train African American women to be nurses themselves. She also establishes a self-supporting college in Tennessee called Madison College. Later on, it eventually gets rolled into the Adventist Church, but for a long time, it served as the self-supporting model institution of the Adventist Church. And this is a picture of her with Ellen White right there. So she actually knew Ellen White herself, which is pretty cool. So we know that there were women that were serving in all sorts of capacities, including building institutions themselves. I will go ahead and mention John R. Rice as one of the reasons of the decline in women holding official positions in the Adventist church, or the more larger positions in the Adventist church. He's not alone, and he's not an Adventist at all. He was an evangelical who wrote criticizing women in leadership in churches. And one of the women that he trots out that is, bobbed hair, bossy wives, and women preachers, those are all apparently connected to each other, and all are evil according to John R. Rice. And one of the women that he trots out and complains about is one of the women preachers is Ellen White. Now, Ellen White had already died by the time he wrote this work, but it does demonstrate some of the pushback that women were experiencing in the wider community, and why the Adventist church might try to distance itself from the former history of having a lot of women in positions of leadership. So my podcast is called They Also Serve, which it sounds like a funny title, because of course we know that women served. But it's actually based on the title of this woman's book, Covington, who wrote her book, and at the time was writing about how, I've actually tried to research this woman's life quite a bit, and keep hitting up against barriers on it. We do know that she started out in the Midwest, and she eventually died in Maryland. Her husband was, I believe, working for the General Conference at the time. No, he was working out for what's now Washington Adventist University. And she herself actually was working for the GC. But I can't find any information on her beyond that. So if anybody knows who she is, she had no children of her own either. So I don't know. I apparently am only highlighting women who had no children. But not quite really. But if anybody knows, or knows somebody who might be a descendant of her husband who did have children, I'd love to talk to them and find out more. But she did what many, many women throughout time have done, and wanted to highlight in her book, in her preface, she actually talks about how she wants to highlight the role of women in the Adventist church. She says their memories being forgotten. And so she creates a list of women exemplars, of women examples, model women in the Adventist church, because she says otherwise we'll forget about them. She's not the first woman. I actually have done a little thing on Chinese history too. And this was quite common practice amongst women then and throughout history, of creating a list of women trying to retain their memories, and arguing that they're being forgotten. So I stole my title for my podcast from her. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, speaking of my interest in Chinese history, my 3 women in Chinese history, or Adventist Chinese history rather, who are not actually Chinese, I confess that, that are some of the women that I'm most interested in. This is Minnie Hawkins Chrysler on the left. Minnie Hawkins Chrysler had quite the adventurous life. She was born in Tasmania, Australia, so that little island that's kind of like the Wild West of Australia. She grew up there and was converted to Adventism as a young adult, and was persuaded to go from Tasmania to the mainland of Australia and work as an editor and get education there. And indeed, that's what she did. So she went up to and was an editor for a typesetter for a while, and then is talked into going to Avondale. Why she's at Avondale? She's a little girl from the countryside in Tasmania. She needs more money. And so she starts working for Ellen White as an editor, who Ellen White was in Australia at the time, and starts working for her, and also does some teaching on the side and gets her degree. I mean, she was a working woman in all ways, was doing a little bit of everything. And Minnie Hawkins at the time then, ends up she's slated to go as a teacher to Tasmania. At the end of her college education, Ellen White heads back to California, gets back to California, realizes that there's a couple of people back there in Australia that she found really useful to help her in her editing. And one of the people is Minnie Hawkins. And so she writes Minnie Hawkins a letter, and Minnie is now back in Tasmania teaching a school. They want her to be the new education director for the Tasmanian conference field. And Ellen White writes her letter and says, "Please, Minnie, will you come to California and join me as an editor for me here?" And Minnie says at first, "Well, I'm taking care of my invalid mother, but if I can make arrangements for that, or if she passes away, then I'll come to California." And Minnie's mother does die, and so Minnie gets on a boat, goes all the way from Tasmania up to California, to have her first adventure, first of many adventures in life, and becomes an editor for Ellen White in California. While she's there, by this time she's quite a bit older. She's not a young woman anymore. She meets one of the Ellen White's other editors, C.C. Chrysler, who's the kind of stern-looking guy next to her. And C.C. Chrysler is married, has a little girl. One day, C.C. Chrysler's wife is playing the piano in the middle of church and dramatically drops dead. Presumably had a heart attack. So C.C. Chrysler is left and keeps working as an editor for Ellen White with a young daughter. Apparently, Minnie catches Chrysler's eye. Now that he's a single man again, and thank you. And after his first wife died, he proposes to Minnie, and indeed they get married in a quiet fashion. By this time, Minnie is quite a bit older, so they don't end up having any children. Back to, I think I get to one woman anyways who has kids. But they never have any children because she's older by the time she gets married to him. And then after his wife has died and he's gone remarried, and both of them are working for Ellen White. Ellen White is getting quite old at this point, falls and breaks her hip, and then after a bit dies. And now they're both out of a job. They're unemployed and have a child to support as well. And Chrysler goes to the GC session, and while the president is speaking, he turns over and he says, "Chrysler, we need more people serving in China, and will you go to China?" And Chrysler agrees to go to China. So Chrysler goes home and tells Minnie about this, which apparently Minnie was up for the adventure too. And so they pack up their things and head to China, where he serves in a number of capacities in the Adventist church in China. And Minnie goes back to what she had been doing in Australia and becomes a teacher again in the Far East Academy. But, as it is, I'm back to the pastoral experience that oftentimes women get roped into their husbands' jobs as well. And indeed, Minnie Chrysler does. Her husband is supposed to be the editor of the local Adventist denominational paper that they're handing around and spreading around. Well, her husband's traveling a lot, half of the year. How is he going to put out a periodical that he's supposed to be editing and soliciting articles and stuff like that to put in? Well, Minnie ends up becoming the editor, and definitely sometimes her name appears in the letterhead as the editor, sometimes it's his name. But for a lot of the period of time that he's working out in China, she's actually doing some of the editing anyways of the Adventist periodical there. So she wore many hats in China. Now I'm going to start sniffing. Sorry. Just a second. Poor Minnie. She suffered a lot of loss through her life. One day, her husband's supposed to go back to the U.S. to do a report of the work in China as part of his job. And he had gotten a little bit sick. But he, being the very determined traveler that he was, decides that nonetheless, he needs to gather one more story for his report. He needs to go to the far reaches of China, and he does head out to the far reaches of China. that you have to travel. The food isn't very good there. The hotels are definitely, the inns that you're staying in are definitely not good inns. I tried to describe to some students the other day bed bugs and the dangers of bed bugs. There were definitely probably bed bugs in the inns he was staying in. He was already a little bit sick. By the time he's been out there for a few weeks, he's really sick and has pneumonia and actually ends up dying, and the far reaches far away from Shanghai where Minnie is, and dies. Minnie then has a choice. She actually travels all the way over and to where her husband died and was there for his burial. She has a choice. She can either go back to the United States or she can stay in China. And Minnie surprisingly chooses to stay in China, and continues the service. She puts together her husband's works on the China mission experience, publishes his work, edits it and publishes it, but also stays in China as a teacher, an editor, a writer, and continues to do her best in serving the China mission field. And then there are threats of Japan at this point in time. And Japan, we were already up into the 1930s and the late 1930s. There's a threat that Japan is has already invaded the north of China, Manchuria, and has taken over that part. And there's threats that the Japanese are wanting to come down Japan and take over all of China. And everybody's very aware that this is going to happen. And there's threats of invasions from Japan all over the Pacific. And the United States was quite aware of this, and the GC officials back in the United States were very aware that there was a danger, that there was going to be an imminent invasion by the Japanese. And so they start thinking, what are we going to do? We have a lot of missionaries in China. We have a brilliant idea. We're going to send them to the Philippines. There are U.S. military bases in the Philippines. The U.S. would never let them be invaded and fall. They would fight to the death to save it. And so they pack up women like Minnie Chrysler, who were considered non-essential employees, basically, or women, and they packed up all the women and children, well, not all the women and children, as I'll point out at one exception, and send them off to the Manila, Philippines, just in time for Pearl Harbor to occur. On the same about time period as Pearl Harbor is attacked, the Japanese attack Manila. And so Minnie Chrysler gets to be one of the first people who is interned by the Japanese. Oops. Minnie is not a young woman by now, if you've done the math. 1874 is when she was born. We're talking that she is now I have to sit here and do the math myself. She's not young. Anyway, she's in her 60s. And she is now a prisoner of the Japanese. Now, the Japanese internment was a little weird in the Philippines. Sometimes they kind of released them and let especially the missionaries who didn't see much of a threat, they didn't really hold on to them the whole time and have them imprisoned. But at the end of the World War II, when the Japanese knew that they were losing, right, they stuck all the basically people that they could hold on to as hostages, put them together, and that she was one of the many people held in Bilbao prison, I believe it was, at the end. And as the Japanese are losing, they have less access to food. They're just basically taking all the food that they can in the Philippines and feeding it to their own soldiers, and so the Filipinos are starving as well as the people that they're holding in internment, because those people are non-essential. They don't care if they die, and so they're not getting fed well. And Minnie Chrysler writes in her report back to the Adventist Church of this experience, saying that she thought she was going to die. She was certain she was going to die because she had lost so much weight. She thought the Japanese were going to kill them, and there was precedent for this. The Japanese had killed prisoners of war in Palawan, actually. I was talking to somebody about Palawan earlier today. And so they had actually killed some of the prisoners of war in Palawan, so there was a definite concern that if the Japanese lost control, that they would kill all the missionaries that were still there. And Minnie Chrysler and her fellow internees in Bilbao prison were quite certain that they were going to die any day now, and she would die of starvation if nothing else, she was sure. And then somebody hears a weird noise from the prison, and it's U.S. soldiers or just happen to walk by and hear some weird noises, and they go investigate, and they find all these American missionaries. So she gets rescued at the very end of the war and finally goes back to the United States. So I think her story is a great story of resilience of women in missions. When they really felt dedicated to the mission, when they felt needed and useful, they really served to bolster and uphold the church, even when there was the threat of war. And that brings me to my there's a picture of Minnie Chrysler. Sorry, I should have changed this earlier. With Ellen White, and I'm trying to figure out which one she is. I'm not going to be able to figure that out fast enough. And then her in China. This is actually when she's going to where her husband died to a funeral service there. To Olga Oss, who I suppose is my favorite person. No, they're all my favorite. Okay, I'm sticking with that. Olga Oss, and the reason we know about many of these women is because they were writers, right? So back to, I'm encouraging all of you to go out and write your memoirs, apparently, because then we remember you. If it's not, there's no written record, it's really much harder to delve out the stories of people. But Minnie Chrysler was a writer, editor, so we know something about her. Olga Oss was definitely a writer. And Olga Oss wrote quite a bit about her own experience as a missionary. And actually, like Covington, she also includes in her memoirs, includes reasons why. She includes other women that she keeps lists of who made big contributions to the church because she wants them to be remembered as well. Olga Oss is great because she documents how reluctant she was herself to go as a missionary. Olga Oss didn't want to go as a missionary. She was from the Midwest. She was newly married, and she had had another tragedy. Okay, back to, apparently I like just tragic stories. But she had had a son, her only son that she ever had in her whole life. And they had been newly married, she had a son, and at less than a year of age, he died. And she had buried her son in where they were living at the time in the Midwest. And her husband goes off to meetings and leaves her alone. She's still mourning the loss of her child. And while he's off at meetings, he gets called to China, sort of like Chrysler. And he agrees to go. And he comes home and says, "Hey, honey, we're going to go to China." And she's like, "I don't think so. We're not going to China. You can go to China. I'm going to stay here. Thank you very much." Because she wants to be, I like to think anyway, she doesn't say this is the reason why, but I kind of think that she's probably still going through some depression, and she really wants to stay near where her child was buried. But apparently her husband overrode her, and she ended up going to China with him. But she writes in her book, Triumphs of Faith, how sad she was about going and how reluctant she was as a missionary going out there to China. She didn't want to go. She had no desire to be there. And then her husband is almost immediately, like Chrysler, is out traveling. They made the men work pretty hard that went out as missionaries and sent them off traveling to do evangelism. In fact, he kind of spearheads an early effort to convert Mongolia. He establishes some converts in Mongolia, so he goes a long ways in China. And out towards Tibet, he's trying to work in that area to try to convert and build up some work there and convert the people farther that direction. And so Olga is left for long periods of time by herself. You can only imagine how depressing that would be. You're going in a foreign country, you lost a child within the last 2 years, and now you've lost your husband. You don't speak the language yet. She was supposed to be in language training, but she spoke very little Chinese. Chinese is not an easy language to learn, especially for a full-grown adult, and you're just by yourself all day long. Well, it's not, and she also records in her story of Triumphs of Faith that she had seen a kind of dramatic, this is during the warlord period in China where there's a lot of infighting and there's different kind of warlords controlling various parts of China and a lot of infighting. And she saw an execution in the middle of the town that she was living in. And I don't know if it was the execution or depression or whatever, but she got deathly ill. And actually got so deathly ill that one day she passes out on the floor, and she has a woman coming in, cleaning the house, and the woman comes in, sees her laying on the floor, is like, "Oh dear, there's a white person that's dead. What am I gonna do?" And so apparently the person who was cleaning for her was quite resourceful and got, I believe it was a German ambassador, called the German embassy or something, and said, hey, I have a dead European here, can you come get them for me? And to their credit, they send some low-level emissary to go check on her, and they're like, hey, she's not dead yet. And so they send her to the Presbyterian hospital across town. And she's then laid up for several days. The doctor's not sure if she's going to survive. Back to I can only imagine depression plus immune system not used to the diseases that she's around and stuff. And so she's deathly ill, but there's a very small church in this town of Adventist, and the women there come and they pray outside of the gate of the hospital all night long, every night for her. And that experience is a moving experience to Olga, she said, and writes in her memoirs, if they were going to dedicate their time to me, a person who didn't speak their language, they didn't really know, then I should have just a tiny bit of the commitment they have and minister to them as much as they have ministered to me. So once she recovers from her illness, she decides to do a 180 and have a turn of attitude about this experience in China, and dedicates herself to trying to learn Chinese and to looking around to see how she can be of service. Now, her husband was traveling all over the place and was not at home. But nonetheless, the General Conference Brethren, bless their hearts, sorry, I'm a little lived in Texas. I've lived all over the place. Lived in Texas, so bless your hearts is good Southernism. Had said, hey, you are a missionary, and so you're supposed to help raise money for missions, and here's a stack of books that you're supposed to be passing out in English, presumably, and you're supposed to go around in-gathering, which is, I don't know that any of you, well, you might know what in-gathering is. I remember in-gathering from my childhood. We go around and knock on doors and ask for money for missionaries, for mission service, and her husband is given this quota of how much money he's supposed to be raising, and he's supposed to be selling these books and stuff like that. And she's like, he's never going to be able to do it. He's not here. He's like way across the country. There's no way he's going to do that. So she's like, hey, here's a way I can serve. So she starts doing in-gathering and knocking on doors. And she's aware enough of herself that she's like, I'm white. I should not go be asking Chinese for donations. But I can go to the European merchants and stuff that are in town. I can go to the American ambassador and stuff like that. People like that are white like me, and ask them for money. I'm not going to ask Chinese merchants for money. And one day she goes to a door and knocks on it, and there is she thinks it's a European-owned business, but it isn't. It's a Chinese-owned business. And the Chinese merchant that's there she says, oh, I'm so sorry, I was going to do a gathering with you, but you're Chinese and I didn't mean to, bother you. And he's like, oh, no, you should go ahead. If a European is paying for, education and hospitals here in China, I want to help out too. And so that changes her attitude a little bit towards appealing to Chinese for donations as well. But what really changes her too is that some of the women see her going out and gathering and selling these books, and they're like, oh, we want to help you. How can we help out? And so she starts training Chinese women to go out and to sell books and to help with the in-gathering and everything like that. So she ends up becoming quite the trainer of other women and encouraging them to go out and act as what we call Bible women, which are basically women that would give Bible studies. And actually some of the Bible women, and I don't think I have a slide with the Bible women in my presentation today, which I should have, but I don't. We have some records of the Bible women. Do I have a picture? No, I don't have a picture of them. The Bible women, however, were very cool because they actually, we have records of them raising churches and leading churches, basically being kind of pastors of small churches scattered throughout China. Quite a few of them actually, some of them do get martyred, sadly and tragically, during the strife between the Communist and the Nationalist Party in China. Some of them end up being victims of that strain. But they were quite a bit foundational to the Adventist church in China at the time. There's a picture of Olga Oss from her book, and also a picture of her being carried throughout the community. So She apparently was very good at what she did in call portering and fundraising. In fact, so good that when they decided to establish an Adventist hospital in Manila, in the Philippines, they actually called Olga Oss, and asked her to come and to serve as well. Whoops, sorry, bumping the thing accidentally. There we go. They actually asked her to come across to the Philippines and train people there as well on how to do fundraising. And so Manila Sanitarium, the first version of the Manila Sanitarium, was there because of Olga Oss's efforts. And in fact, we still have a hospital. There's an Adventist hospital in downtown Manila that came out of that Manila Sanitarium. She also was instrumental in the building of Shenyang Hospital. She actually went and solicited a warlord for the money and property for the building of this particular hospital. And so she actually goes talks to the warlord and persuades him into giving her the money for it, and he does. So she was not a wilting violet by the end of her life by any means. Much like Minnie Chrysler, she ends up being she has quite a different experience. I wasn't aware of how many experiences people could have in World War II internment camps until I did this paper originally. So she lived in Shanghai all during the war and even before the war. So she sees some of the first fighting and action between the Japanese and Chinese, and writes letters back home to her sister that get published in American newspapers, detailing some of the atrocities that happened in Shanghai when the Japanese first attacked China and down in Shanghai. So, and she raises money for this care of people through the Red Cross. So there was a lot of connections between Adventists and the Red Cross at the time, especially through the hospital system. And so she does public speaking and fundraising for the Red Cross as well as for the Adventist Church. I guess that again is a hint at how good of a fundraiser she was, and that she wasn't afraid of asking people for money, no matter what the program it was. Like Minnie Chrysler in some ways, she too ends up being in a Japanese internment camp, though her experience was quite a bit different. Unlike Minnie Chrysler, because she wasn't married, she was married. She didn't have any children, like Minnie Chrysler, but she was much younger than Minnie Chrysler when the threat of World War II began to be evident. And when they start shoving all the women and children to the Philippines to try to protect them, Olga Oss says, no, I'm staying with my husband. I'm going to stay here in China, and I'm going to stay here in Shanghai. So she gets interned instead of in Manila, in Shanghai. And while she's interned with her husband, I don't know if this was a blessing or a curse for her, but her husband gets very ill. And they apparently didn't make the men like they did the women. He got very ill and got so ill that the Japanese, the person that was in charge of the Japanese internment camp decided that this guy's going to die. We don't really want him to die. It's early enough in the war that we don't want this American to die. So we're going to send him off to the hospital, and they get persuaded to send him off to the hospital. But then she doesn't get any word for, I think it's like 2 years, of what happened to her husband. He goes off to the hospital, never to be seen again, apparently, to her. So she's quite certain that he's dead. She's not sure if he's dead or alive, up to the end of the war. And then at the end of the war, a Chinese Adventist who came to her and said, "Hey, your husband's still alive. I know where he is. He's still in this hospital." And so brings her to show her that her husband is still alive. But I can't imagine going for months and months and months and not knowing what happened to your husband, whether he was alive or dead, for all that time. But she too survives the war, which is a good thing. And then it spends the next few years going around raising funds for what she goes back to the United States to recover, because a lot of the people that were in internment camps lost tons and tons of weight. And so she went around as a Red Cross fundraiser for a little while they were trying to recover from their war experience. But not content with just going to China once, and having been interned and all of that, she and her husband decide, hey, we know Chinese already. We're set to go as missionaries again. And so she and her husband go back to China after recovering from their experience and actually end up getting kicked out by the communists, or some of the last people kicked out by the communists in Shanghai. Probably they waited a little longer than they should, because there's always the danger that having foreigners there would actually draw persecution under the communists. But they go twice as missionaries then to China. So Olga Oss is a very fascinating woman, and it perhaps indicates a few of the many women that have contributed to raising money to missions. And again, those Bible women, I wish I had a picture up to here. I'm so sorry I didn't have a picture for you guys. But the Bible women in China did so much to raise the Adventist church, raise funds, and support the church in China even today. You may be aware that at least shortly after the Adventist church, I'm going to fast forward through all these. After the Adventist church was allowed, there was some openness in the communist church in communist China to allow Adventist churches to be run again, that some of the largest churches were actually run by women who restarted the church. And I just want to point out Hao Yuji, whose name I'm probably not saying quite right, but I like to think that her mother was one of those Bible women. Maybe she wasn't, but I can't trace it myself, so I always have hope that this is the case. Because Hao Yuji became a pastor in part because of her mother. Her mother, even when Christianity wasn't supposed to be promulgated in China, would go to bus stations, and when she was getting on a bus, she would talk to people about Jesus. She would share her faith, even though it could risk persecution for herself. And when the communist China started to allow churches to exist, she turned to her daughter, who she said, "Hey, daughter, you are a very talented speaker. Why don't you become a pastor? We need a pastor here in our community." And apparently her mother was as persuasive to other people as she was to her own daughter. And so Hao Yuji became pastor, and was up till her retirement was a pastor of one of the largest churches in China, in fact the largest church in China, and had a lot of what we call daughter churches, so her church was a mother church. In other words, it was sort of like a conference office. The mother church is kind of the center of administration, and then the daughter churches are basically churches that are associated to the mother church. And Hao Yuji had lots of daughter churches that came out from her mother church, where she would train pastors and send them out to communities and start churches elsewhere. So I like to think that some of Olga Oss's legacy of training women and women training other women lived on in Hao Yuji. I can't really prove it though, but I like to think that. I just want to point out that women have had a rich legacy in the Adventist Church of both promoting missions as well as financially supporting the church with all of their efforts. And I hope that their stories inspire you to go forth and also serve your community and serve your church like Olga Oss.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. We have time for a few questions and answers, as well as those watching online. I have my phone, and if you respond to that QR code that Gumi has out, I can see your messages and ask Dr. Campbell from there. As I give you a moment to think, and Michelle can look also for responses, I'll start off with a question of my own. What do you think of the current trajectory? What is your hope within the Adventist denomination for continuing to expand in making women pastors available everywhere? What's the trajectory look like to you in that regard?
Ooh, I'm not a good prophet, I have to confess. So I have a hard time looking forward to the future. I see images of promise and hope, and also images that make me a little cautious about being too optimistic. So I don't know if you're aware, but the Biblical Research Institute has its first woman that they've hired, so that was very exciting. That was just appointed. So that makes me hopeful that there's more integration of women's voices in our Adventist theology, and that we're considering women's perspective in that regard. I know that there are women pastors in Africa and parts of Asia. I mentioned that a little bit last night. And so I see hope that there's more interest in integrating women and integrating all voices, in the church, and a recognition that women's ministry is really important to the church. However, I've also seen the United States become more conservative over the last few years, so I don't know what that'll mean for the trajectory of the church, too. I know the U.S., the Adventist church is not outside of culture entirely, and so what's happening in the larger cultural milieu impacts as much as impacts the Adventist church itself, as much as we like to think that religion is outside of culture, and unfortunately oftentimes we're very much inside culture, right? So I see pictures, images of hope, but also I'm a little cautious.
Thank you. Yes, Carla.
I was interested in your use of figures from the apocryphal books of the Bible.
Oh.
And one of the ones you did not mention is Susanna and the elders.
Yes.
And I think there are lessons we could learn from that story about the way men should be treating women in their position in the world. Can you mention something about that?
Oh, Susanna and the elders, for those of you who aren't familiar with this story, it's the story of two elders seeing Susanna, and I may get this wrong because I haven't quite reviewed Susanna and the elders recently, but Susanna is out bathing and the two men spot her and they attempt to rape her. And they're two elders, so they're people in authority in the community, right? And so she has to fight to hold, not only does she resist it, but then they accuse her of, but they bring her to trial anyways in front of the elders, and they abuse their authority to try to put her down, and she ends up escaping that. But it was a very popular image, you're quite right, in the 16th and 17th century. Again, like Judith, even though there's a pushback on the Apocrypha in Protestantism, and kind of like the Apocrypha is not really part of the Bible, they like to use those stories, and it does become a cautionary tale about how magistrates have abused power. And I think we have numerous instances today, too, of how people in positions of power can easily abuse women and women's voices when they're marginalized, when they're treated as, when they don't have equal authority in events. Susanna's story was very much a very important part of the 16th century preaching. You're quite right.
Yes.
Well, I just turned very quickly to Joel when the Lord says that he's going to pour out his spirit upon the earth, and your young men and your young women shall prophesy, etc., etc. Do you see this as a God-directed movement as opposed to something that happens within the organization of the churches in using women?
Yes, of course. I mean, it doesn't matter what an institution does. We need to remember that it's just an institution, and that really our answer is not to the institution, but our answer is to God, and serving God in whatever capacity He calls us to, whether or not we are actually paid for the position. Obviously being paid and having a voice that participates in it is important too. I like to think, because the economic factor shows that voice is valued then, right? But women have throughout time always, volunteered their services, and I didn't talk about all of the figures or about the financial aspect of it, but for a lot of the women as missionaries, especially when their husbands would first go, when they weren't sure what they were going to do with the wives, often weren't paid. And so they were basically volunteers. And though that also went for both couples, sometimes they both were volunteers. And I didn't actually talk about, the people in South America and Peru. Stalls, yes, that I had up there briefly. Anna and Fernando Stahl initially went as self-supporting missionaries. We don't need to wait for an institution always to give us a rubber stamp that God calls us to service, and that is a sign of the end, that it's important for us to do what God calls us to do, right?
Anybody else? Yeah.
Yes, in one of the previous discussions, you mentioned this lady whose name I'm blocking on right now, married the pastor of the Salzburg church,
Yeah.
and wrote a letter in defense of his marriage. Now, Salzburg, you said, was sort of diverse and had Catholics and Protestants and Anabaptists, what have you. The Lutheran religion hadn't been around that long, and historically the Catholic Church did not allow their priests to marry. Do you think that there might have been some overlap in her motivation in that her husband, who was a Lutheran and in a new church relatively, was being defended for the fact that priests of any caliber should be allowed to marry?
So he was in Strasbourg, and he was definitely he actually writes in defense of clerical marriage as well later on. Part of the controversy with her writing was that she was a woman writing, and in fact she addresses it to the bishop. The letter that she writes that gets published is an open letter to the bishop. So she is, as a woman, arguing that she has the right to speak to the bishop and tell the bishop that he's wrong. So there were all sorts of no-nos going on in this letter. And indeed, this is the trickiness of her marriage to him. There's a good chance that the Protestant Reformation is going to be crushed by the Catholic Church, right? By the power of the Catholic Church. They had crushed all other heresies before in the past, the most famous one being maybe the Waldensians, though they didn't really crush the Waldensians because there's still people who trace their heritage to Waldenses from now. There's a church currently now that has descended from the Waldensians. But they had been able to successfully crush other elements of dissent, right? Or at least repress them. So there was a good chance that he was going to be out of a job and going to be burned at the stake. In fact, the same year that they were married, there were at least 3 notable burnings at the stake, not that far from Strasbourg. So definitely a kind of scary prospect to marry. He was definitely pointing himself out as the first person, if the Catholics decided they wanted to repress, to come in and burn him. Lots of no-nos that were going on in her defense of marriage.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did I answer your question fully? Okay.
Scanning the audience here. Anybody else?
Yeah, I guess I'm getting them, so yes, I guess so. And I'm going to sit down because my feet are going to hurt me here.
I was just curious about something involving Pontius Pilate's personage in the story. There's something about that. My own studies of ancient Rome have focused around the Julio-Claudian emperors, Tiberius, obviously. And in my travels in the Mediterranean, I uncovered a number of individuals and writings that attest quite passionately about the place of Pilate in that situation. He was apparently, according to this tradition, he was in a sticky wicket in that situation because he was the son-in-law of Tiberius. He had married Tiberius's daughter, Claudia Procula. And Claudia, in many churches there in Europe, is said to have become Christian and is worshipped as a saint. And I was just curious if you had ever uncovered anything of that sort, because it continues, and I just wanted to know what you thought about that.
Okay, so you're extending past my area of focus by quite a bit, so I'm not going to be really able to answer that question, unfortunately. I've only... it's on looking back at how they're talking about Mary Magdalene that had come across Pontius Pilate. So I can't say, that's outside my area of question, but it is fascinating.
Talked about as one of the women.
Yes. And she's the one that goes and tells Tiberius that this guy, you need to get rid of him. So it's more, I've looked on the opposite side. I haven't looked in that, so I can't tell you too much about Pontius Pilate.
How does it feel to you? Does that feel like an unwarranted passion on the outside of it, a passionate thing that people have picked up and has
That the story happened. I think it would be pretty incredible if a Jewish woman could go and talk to the Emperor Tiberius. I think that story seems a little bit outside of the realm of possibility of actually happening, because for her to go and complain, about Pontius Pilate to the emperor seems like that would be very extraordinary, especially since there would be no indication that she was a Roman citizen, unlike Paul, who would have had access to at least royal courts, not royal courts, to Roman courts. I think that's more of a tradition that would be outside of the realm of real lived experience. That would be my guess.
Well, thank you, Dr. Campbell. Maybe my final question, then we can wrap it up here. I've noticed from when your husband was here, and historians in general, I always like to ask what your next interest and fascination is, because historians seem to be curious. So what areas are you currently looking at, or as you have time, are you interested in looking at in your field?
So somebody was asking me at lunchtime about what I was working on right now, and I'm working full time, so you don't have a lot of time to do research, unfortunately. Then it would be lovely if I did have more time. I am working right now on doing some research on the Virgin Mary, which I have written about before, but on the Virgin Mary and the impact of Anabaptists, which was one of the comments I made to one of the questions last night, and what caused the Virgin Mary to be repressed or come forward in sermons. And I kind of view fears of Anabaptists as one of the things that either pushes it down or brings it out to light anyways. So that's one of my areas of interest. I would like to go back to England and do some more research on Thomas Walkington. I briefly mentioned his sermon in 1620 that was all focused on the Mary Magdalene. It's a fascinating sermon, very dramatic, very sad, very heart-rending. I mean, the whole sermon's about sorrow and about suffering. And about Christ uplifting the suffering. So I think it's a beautiful sermon, at least to me. It's a little overly dramatic, a lot of people think, but a little bit on the modeling side. Okay, sorry, that's because modeling comes from the word Magdalene, so it's a little, anyways. So I would like to do some, but there's not much known about Thomas Walkington himself, other than that he wrote a popular work earlier in his life too, and he had published another sermon or two. Anyways, so I'd like to see if I can't uncover anything else about him. But that requires another research to England, and England, unfortunately, is not the cheapest place in the world to go to, so we'll see. But there's always, I think, historians, or anybody in academia, actually, you're curious, right? You want to know. And so there's always new things that come to light that you want to know. Like, I didn't talk about women in the Adventist church that are involved in healthcare, but the more you probe and look at Adventist reviews, the more you find that women were heavily involved in healthcare and the founding of hospitals and stuff in the 19th century. Well, what we're sanitariums now, hospitals, and other things I want to know. Okay, and also I keep coming across women that have, and men actually too, that have been divorced in early Adventist history. We don't think of 19th century people getting divorced or having marriages annulled, but that apparently is not the case. I didn't talk about her, but Petra Tunam, who goes to Indonesia as a missionary, was divorced and ends up becoming essentially the conference president, because she was the last woman standing, so she was conference president for a while in Indonesia. And I am curious about how Adventist pioneers interacted with divorce and what their theology of divorce was. We haven't really looked, I don't know that anybody's done a lot of research on that. So yes, lots of things that I'd like to keep working on. So we'll see.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi. Can we give her a round of applause? And then one more time, I'll plug the podcast. That was super meaningful to me. If anybody wants the pamphlet that has the QR code or the link to where to find the podcast, you can grab that from Dr. Campbell. And maybe I will just say a closing prayer for a safe flight as you go back tonight, and a blessing to you and your family. Dear God in heaven, we are thankful that we can learn from the history. It gives so much insight into the present. and on how we interpret and glean from inspiration, including the Bible. Be with Dr. Campbell as she flies home tonight. Keep her safe. Be with her children as they study and learn. And may her curiosity lead to continuing unfolding of truths that help us as a congregation and citizens in the world to be ambassadors for your peace, goodness, and equality for all. Be with us now, and we pray this in your name. Amen.